Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 6th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. And today we're going to be talking to author Daniel Price. But before we dive in, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Now, the number one way to support the show is to visit www.patreon.com/talknerdy, like the following folks have already done. I want to thank Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Rob Schreck, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Jeffrey Perez, Charles Payette, Jonathan Wright, Christian Jeffrey, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. If you want a shout out on the show, you've just got to pledge $25 in support per episode. But of course, anything helps out. I've got individuals on my Patreon who are pledging 25 cents an episode, and I am truly appreciative of their support. It's because of support from listeners like you that Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. All right, guys, I'm really excited about today's episode. I got to have a chat just a few weeks ago now with Daniel Price. He's an author of a trilogy, really. He's only written the first two books, but it's always had the intention of being a trilogy. The first book was The Flight of the Silvers, and the book that just recently came out, you can get it on Amazon right now, is The Song of the Orphans. Now, we talk quite a bit about Daniel's alternative, kind of beautiful world that he has created. And also, sci-fi in general, fantasy in general. And we get a little bit personal, a little bit of conversation about what it is to be alive, what it is to die, and what happens when you face your mortality, how that affects your concept of time. And Daniel himself will share a very personal story that has really informed his work. So, guys, without any further ado, here he is, Daniel Price. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, of course, you publish under your, I'm assuming, what is your given name, Daniel Price. Do you go by Dan or Daniel?
Either one, anything but Danny.
Good to know. I'll keep that in mind.
My mom still calls me that, but I let her get away with it, nobody else.
I noticed, I have to even say, before we even dive into the book or anything else, I noticed on your FAQ on your website that you and your wife have the same last name, not because she took your name, but because you had the same last names to begin with.
My fiance, we're not married yet.
Oh, your fiance.
Yep. She, her last name was just coincidental. So it was, it's a time saver.
Oh my gosh.
Once we do get married, we
Seriously.
won't have to fight over who keeps whose name. But
yeah, you won't have to change your passport. You want to, and also, even if she was like, "Yeah, I wouldn't have changed my name for you anyway," you don't have to have that fight.
Exactly. Well, I still wanted her to hyphenate it, be Price, but she's not going for it. But no, it was really funny because when I first posted about her on Facebook, I had all these old college friends who were like, oh, "When did you get married?" I'm like, "We didn't. We just already had the same name."
That is hilarious. Oh my gosh, I love it.
That's funny.
So you, of course, are Daniel Price, and you are an author. You have published now, am I right in saying your third book, but your second book in a sci-fi series?
Exactly. A Song of the Orphans is my third novel, but it's the second one in the Silver series.
Excellent. And so the first book in that series was actually called Flight of the Silvers.
And still is, I hope.
Thank you for catching my tense issues. See, you should be editing my school papers. That would be really helpful. So first, The Flight of the Silvers, now The Song of the Orphans. And you recently announced that you're working on your third book, right?
The third and final book of the series is called The War of the Givens. Yes, it's you see I have a grammatical syntax theme going on here, but it works.
Absolutely. Well, let's start by diving in. I mean, you would consider this part of the sci-fi genre. Is it at all genre bending, or would you say that this is kind of clean, pure sci-fi?
I think it is, if you really had to ask me, I would say in terms of structure and conceit, it is more fantasy than sci-fi.
I see. Okay.
I mean, this is not hard science fiction by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I have some really kooky concepts in there, but I don't spend pages talking about like the molecular makeup of this or that. Mm-hmm. What I really do in this book is I play with time. There are at least a dozen different forms of temporal manipulation. in this story that, I researched and I had a lot of fun with it. But if you ask me to justify the science behind it, all I can give you is a shrug. It's completely the product of my imagination. But it deals with apocalyptic quests and lots of life or death battles. In that sense, it probably has more in common with fantasy, and it's also like a whole parallel Earth that might as well be a like Middle Earth or something. It's in many ways so radically different from the Earth we know that it's essentially a fantasy world. So I had a lot of fun with that, but I don't know if I'd call it genre bending, but it definitely does have elements of a couple different. It's not married to one particular genre.
Well, and I think that that's it's important, and it's also really, I don't know, relevant. There are so many individuals who really appreciate both of those genres. There does seem to be so much crossover
Oh
between
yeah,
sci-fi and fantasy, and whole cultures kind of around
absolutely.
appreciating that. Yeah. Have you found that there are, Silver's fans? Are there
You,
people who are like geeking out and creating their own games and really on forums about it?
as I do actually, and it has been like so wonderfully freaky when that happens. I had two book bloggers who they're so good. They love the book so much they dedicate a whole month on their blogs to
Yeah,
pushing the book. Your dog's very happy to hear that.
he
He has
was.
every
He was
right to
like,
be.
"Yay, yay, bloggers!"
So go bloggers. And there is a fantastic woman in England. Her name, she's a pop synth recording artist
Oh,
who goes
neat.
by the name Quarter Sooner. She loved the book so much she came up with all these tracks inspired by the book.
Oh my gosh,
And
that must have been so wonderful to
oh,
hear.
it really just blew my mind. And she was like so talented too. And she wrote like a theme song for each of my characters. And just like listening to him blew me away because she's like she understood him exactly.
Oh, that's
Like,
so cool.
yeah, I've never had anything like that before, and it was just like so humbling when people do that. And even just like the little things. A woman emailed me just 3 days ago to say that thank me for my book helping her through hard times. That her son had been in the ICU for a week, and she was just beside herself. And my book kind of just took her out of the world for just as long as she needed. She would sneak a couple of pages here and there, and
Hmm.
she said it helped her keep sane.
Well, and I
Uh,
wanted to talk about this a little bit later, but I feel like this is a really good kind of segue to what I know seems to have been really instrumental prior to the development of these books for you is that you were struggling with your own difficulties, and
yes.
that's sort of mirrored in your pages a bit.
Yes, it was in 2006. I was diagnosed with stage 2 testicular cancer,
Hmm.
and I was just in my early 30s at the time. I'd never been sick before. I barely went to a doctor about anything. I mean, I could have had a pit bull chewing on my ankle, and people would say, "Dan, maybe you should see a doctor about that." I'd be like, "Nah, he'll get tired." But then suddenly I was dealing with something, and then we were talking about survival rates and everything else, and it just was like, whoa, I just was not used to that.
Yeah.
And when you're that age, you don't really face your mortality in any serious way, unless you're in the army or a cop or something. So it was really, really intense, but it, many ways, it took about 5 months for me, surgery, chemo, and everything else to get better. And by the way, I've been cancer free for 11 years now. So,
Wow.
yeah, I
Yeah, that's
was waiting for your
great.
dog to bark,
I
in support of that.
know. He stopped listening apparently.
Oh, Jesus,
Yeah.
he's so fickle, that dog.
Yeah, seriously.
But it did a couple great things for me. One, I've been after my first novel, Slick was
Hmm.
totally different. It wasn't sci-fi. It was just a story about PR and media manipulation that had been burning a hole in my head for ages.
Which is so important and so fascinating.
Yeah, it was really it was so much fun to write, and it was really cathartic to write about it. It just exercised a lot of my anger I had about the way the media was and is.
Hmm.
Uh, but so it got huge critical acclaim, and the sales were terrible. It was like just It didn't do well at all. So I was really kind of like stymied for a couple of years after that. I knew I had this huge story idea in my head, the Silver
Mm.
series, but I was just afraid to write it. I'm like, oh God, what if I spend 10 years on this and like four people read it and hate it? It's like I
Oh.
don't want to. It's like, what do I do? What do I do? And the cancer, I was in paralysis with it. I just didn't take a chance on it until the cancer lit a fire under me. It's like, if you're not going to do it now, when are you going to do it?
So were you actually starting to work on it when you were in and out of the hospital?
I was only developing it in my head. That was
Okay.
all. That was all I dared to do. I've been developing it in my head on and off for like probably close to 20 years now.
Mm.
But I was too afraid. I didn't commit to it until after the cancer, to actually sitting down and starting to write it. And I had no idea if it would sell or not. I wasn't even sure if I would be like blackballed after the bad sales of my first book. Like no one's ever going to even consider me because I was like, oh no. But amazingly, it sold in the first round of submissions, and I got a 2-book deal out of it. So that worked out very, very nicely. Um, so as I got to write the sequel, that was the first book I've ever written where I knew in advance that it was going to be published, which, let me tell you, it takes so much pressure off.
Oh, I can only imagine. And it's sort of that juxtaposition or that paradox of your first book getting all of this really wonderful
Uh,
press, but then people not purchasing it. I'm wondering, is this a common dilemma for some new authors?
Absolutely, yeah. It is. It's such a crowded market, and
Mm.
I mean, my first book came out before the whole self-publishing boom. So I mean, now there's even more competition than ever. Books that are like 1/5 the price
Yeah.
of
Ugh.
what publishers are pricing it at. So there's definitely a lot more competition now, and it's really hard to get a foothold. But Penguin was smart with Flight of the Silvers. For the first 2 weeks, they priced the ebook at $2.99 and sold thousands and thousands of copies, which gave me the head start I needed.
Oh, that's so smart. And you know
Yeah,
what? It does seem to be the case that even when you look back at classic literature, many, acclaimed authors who have moved into, they're long dead now, but have,
right,
dozens of printings, their first attempts only got legs after, their hit book sold.
right. Yeah, it's the whenever I always laugh when someone's called an overnight success because they know the
Yeah,
people deep down. It's like,
exactly.
yes, I worked 20 years to be an overnight success. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everybody could probably remember that and take it to heart. That, what seems from the outside to be somebody just stumbling into really good luck, very often they have been pulling levers behind the scenes for decades.
Right. I figure I met a reader at Comic Con back in July, and he was like, "God, your book is so great. Why haven't I heard of you before?" I don't know how to answer that.
I know.
I'd heard of me.
It's so funny when people give backward compliments. They think they're being so nice, and then you're like, wow, you just said that, didn't you? To
Yeah.
my
No,
face.
I took it in the spirit that it was meant. If somebody reads my book and compliments me on the font and the margins, I'll know that they didn't like it. But
Yeah, like the cover art was really it was
yeah, it's
good.
great,
I like
great spine, great spine.
yeah, it's really sturdy. It's a sturdy book. Well, and
Right.
hilariously speaking of that, this is a big book.
Ugh, I know.
This is a tome you wrote. How long
It,
did it take you? And we're talking about the second book in the series right now because that's the
yeah,
most recent publication. But how long, let's say just standalone, The Song of the Orphans, the second book, did
four
it
years.
take you? 4 years. And was there crossover with the first book or no?
No, Silvers had been done for a while when I got the book deal.
Mm.
So I mean, we still had to edit it, of course, but I had a good lead time on some because once Silvers got the book deal, it was still a good 18 months before it reached bookstores. So once I knew I was okay to write book two, I started. So that gave me the head start I needed. But of course, still, it ended up being 3.5 years between book releases because this is the biggest book I've ever written, and it's 240,000 words,
Wow.
which is about as long as the longest Harry Potter book. So, and I really was like, I George R. R. Martin did to death because I worked and worked and worked on it, and I revised probably a little bit too much in some places. And in a couple of instances, I just threw out like a couple of chapters
Yeah.
willy nilly because I just wasn't happy with them. I'm trying to be more efficient and nicer to myself with book 3. Because, first of all, I don't want people waiting like 5 years for this. And secondly, there comes a point where you do too much polishing, too much revising, and it works to the detriment of the story. And I think I did that a bunch of times with Song of the Orphans, but we fixed it thanks to I have a fantastic editor who just really helped me get the book into shape. But I want to really just kind of hit the ground running with War of the Givens and be more efficient and without sacrificing any quality. It's still going to be a huge book, my third one.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, first of all, I think that readers, especially readers like me who just dive deep into books like this and get super lost, I don't want them to end. And so I appreciate when there's a lot of story in front of me. And of course, it is long and it is large. Like when you hold it in your hands, it's large, but it's still less than 800 pages and it's a fast read. It's not dense and, really convoluted or anything. It's it's a
one of the
page
nicest
turner.
Compliments I can get when people say it's it reads much faster than it is, than it
Yeah, absolutely. So it shouldn't scare you off that the spine of the book is 3 inches thick.
Yeah, it definitely, the size of the books, like Flight of the Silvers itself was not exactly svelte. That was 608 pages, and that one took me about 3 years to write. And when you're a relatively unknown writer and your book is going out to reviewers, like book bloggers and professional reviewers, they have a whole stack of books to read. I don't blame them one bit for reaching for the thinner books. They
Yeah.
get paid the same, to read a short book as they do a long book. And so that kind of worked against me a little bit. And the marketers at Penguin warned me. They're like, yeah, this is going to be a hard sell because they're just so freaking big. Even the Harry Potter series started out with short books before she really went crazy.
Yeah.
So, but I gave the story, I gave it the books the length they needed. If to cut more than I cut would have sacrificed something with the characters, with the world I was building, and it's when I'm on my deathbed, hopefully many, many, many years from now, I'm going to look back and say, I don't want to look back and say, well, at least my books came out promptly, or at least they were thin.
Exactly.
I want them done. I want to be happy with them. So, and I want other people to be happy with them. And so, yeah, we'll see. But all that said, my editors on both books, I had 2 different editors, really helped me trim fat. I cut 30,000 from the first book and 40,000 from the second one with their help, and stuff I don't even miss now. Just kind of like, oh, why did I even have that? So it really helps.
It's true, too, that anybody who has to write a lot for their job or for their academic program, I feel like once you've been writing for a very long time, you realize that it's harder to write tersely than it is to fill up pages.
Yeah.
When it's much easier to go fat and then trim the fat than it is to, and it's funny because I think as young people we'll be in school and it's like, you have to write a 10-page, and it's like, 10 pages, how am I ever going to do that? But eventually you realize, how am I going to get it down to only 10 pages?
That was always my problem.
Yeah.
I had to shrink the font, play with the kerning, it's just to get it within the rules. Same thing when I was a screenwriter. I was like, oh, wait, 120 pages? I actually did my screenplays in Quark Express so I could have more control over the tightening and being subtle about it, squeezing 1 or 2 extra lines per page so I can get more story in. I would not compromise.
So tricky you are. I love that. That's so funny.
Well, it helps being a graphic artist for, a day job. You know these tricks.
Oh, I can only imagine. And of course, you mentioned, being good to yourself in trying to come up with a good plan and trying to be efficient and motivated and all the things that you need to do in any career, but especially a career where you are sort of self-motivating. There's no boss telling you what time to start and what time to end. It's tough, and you've got to really be good at planning.
It is, and with creative pursuits also, you're really putting yourself out there. I mean, you're kind of bearing your soul, and then having strangers on the internet of all, judge them, and they are often not kind when they're unhappy.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, but why? And it's part of my growing up as a neurotic New York Jew. I could get 99 good reviews and 1 bad one, and I'll be thinking, oh God, why do they hate me?
Yeah, I know. I feel like that's such human nature, isn't it?
It is definitely human nature.
You're not the first person who's told me that. I've seen many authors, many scientists, many kind of celebrities, actors, singers who are like, I obsess over it. And also sometimes the loudest people are definitely not the most representative people.
Oh my God, no. They are definitely not. And it's a constant balancing act, too, when it comes to criticism, because I don't want to discount all of it. If someone
Hmm.
actually says something that is constructively written and is detailed, is not just like yelling "you suck" from a moving car. It's just
Yeah.
kind of saying, "I wanted to enjoy your book, but is this and this and this kind of held me back a little bit." That's somebody who is, even if you don't agree with them, they're worth listening to. And
Absolutely.
I learned a lot from the criticism about Flight of the Silvers. There were issues with my handling of the female characters in the book that I was not aware of
Hmm.
for the first book. And at first, I was like, the first internet comments just kind of like, you're a sexist. I'm like, what? But I spent years developing these characters. I made them complex, and I gave them strengths and weaknesses, and hopes and dreams, and personal challenges and stuff like that. I'm like, how? But what? But it took one really sharp critic to kind of write a more detailed analysis and said, well, it's not that you made your characters too flawed, but you kind of made the flaws you gave them a little too stereotypical. And
Yeah.
she
Gotcha.
was she was dead right. It took me about a year and a half to come to grips with that criticism, and though it was too late to change these things in Flight of the Silvers, it made me make all new decisions in Song of the Orphans that, like, little things that added up and just made it such a much better experience. And my female characters feel so much like more. They were already naturally progressing anyway.
Hmm.
When you have a you look at Luke Skywalker at the beginning of Star Wars, and it's just kind of, he's a whiny little farm boy, but
Yeah.
he's kicking butt by Empire Strikes Back and just doing all kinds of crazy things. So they were already naturally growing, but I helped, fix old problems when it comes to just casual sexism that I just wasn't even aware of, and it really
Oh,
helped me.
yeah, implicit, and we all have it, and that's why it's so
Right,
important to be reminded. I mean, even women have implicit sexism against women. It's just so
right,
entrenched in the culture. And of course, some things that we do that are stereotypical are stereotypes for a reason. Some things that we
right,
do are completely misguided, and it's just because it's what we're around and what we're up against all the time. But to be able to recognize it, to be able to try and counter it, and to show change and growth, I mean, in a way, it really is mirroring what we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is the scientific process.
mm,
It's not about, the way our politicians will like never apologize for anything and I'm not
right,
a flip-flopper and I don't know. It's about like learning from the past and improving constantly and
exactly,
iterating. And that's wonderful. And I'm sure that
yeah.
your readers, as they go from book one to book two and eventually soon into book three, are growing along with you as a writer, which is just wonderful.
Yeah, it was really gratifying. The woman who wrote the detailed critique of the book, I gave her an
Mm.
early copy of Song of the Orphans, and she loved it. She said, "Oh my God, you listened to me," and that
Ah,
was like the most gratifying thing. It just made me feel so much better about this. It's still a learning process, but when you talk about the scientific method, it's absolutely true because instead of just kind of yelling at me saying you're a sexist, she gave me a full argument. She backed it up with examples from the
mm-hmm.
book, and she presented a full like scientific case. That by the end of it, I was like, my hands were tied. I couldn't not see her point
Yeah.
because
And
she backed it up.
And it's also nuanced, right? Like it's
Oh yeah,
easier to do that when you're like you have these wonderful strong female characters, but these are some of the flaws that I'm seeing that maybe are reiterating stereotypes that I
right,
don't think are healthy. Instead of like, oh, you have no women in your book, or you don't pass the
right.
Bechdel test at all. Like the women in your book never speak to one another, you know?
Yeah, well, luckily all my books passed the living crap out of the Bechtel test, but
Yeah.
there's more to it. They just weren't as nuanced as they could have been in the first book, but they got better. This is more of a problem with the first half of the book, but yeah, no, it makes all the difference in the world. And I don't blame people if they were angry about it because the problems I had in my book were the kinds of things that these readers have seen in 1,000 other books. So it's like a Chinese
Yeah.
water torture effect. And when you see it so many times, it's like, oh, come on already. So I don't blame them, but they can't just expect to yell sexist at me and have me just go, maybe you have a point. You got to give me a case, make a case, show me. And, it's the same, they tell writers, show, don't tell. It should also, go for critics who want to actually convince. If
Absolutely.
they're just looking to vent, that's fine. But if they want to actually persuade the source of their anger, then yeah, show your work. And this one woman did, and I was, it made all the difference in the world.
I love that. It's like such a good case study. And of course, I feel like anybody who's listening to the show right now, maybe in their cars, maybe they are on, a treadmill or the elliptical at the gym, they're probably beating the steering wheel or like the bars in front of them, like, what is the book about? Why aren't you
Oh,
talking about that? So I feel like I shouldn't wait much longer.
right. Yeah. I realize we did forget that. Yeah.
Right?
I'm the worst person to ask because it's like my explanation takes about 6 hours, and probably longer than the audiobook, but it was,
I love that. Okay, well, we gonna get deep, you guys. Don't you worry. So, of course, the book,
okay.
In essence, I mean, I think it's a good piggyback. Is really focused around these two females, isn't it?
The first one is, yeah, the second one's more of an ensemble. The general premise of the book, for those beating their steering wheels right now, it, it is about two sisters and four strangers who are saved from apocalypse by mysterious forces, taken to a whole new Earth with an alternate history where time is manipulated by common household appliances. Where a major event in 1912 changed the whole course of science, and by modern day, basically the fabric of time can be manipulated by technology. So you have every kitchen has what's called a rejuvenator, where you can take spoiled food and turn it into fresh food, or a cold dinner and turn it back into a fresh from the oven. You have people who can movie theaters that have time shifting, so that you can watch a 2 hour movie and just only lose 12 minutes of your day. It's there's so many different. There are things called ghost drills that policemen use. They put it around a crime scene, and they can replay the past as holograms.
Yeah.
So it's like it's changed the whole nature of the world. And so when these characters from our world go there, they're like, they see flying cars and like these temporal force fields, and like, what is going on here? And they also happen to, in the process, develop their own temporal abilities that are very, very different from each other's, and some of them don't even mimic the technology of the world. The youngest character gets notes through a portal from her future selves that will either give her, crucial information, or will just yell at her. Because let's face it, if we all had a past self that we can communicate with, half the time we'd just be yelling, like, "No, you idiot!"
Yeah, like, don't do that. No, you're gonna regret
Exactly.
it.
Exactly. It's so that's something. She's 14 years old and insecure, so she already is. She's her own worst enemy, and now it's
Yeah.
externalized, and she has like thousands of them, different versions of her in the future, who are sending this stuff to her. But in Flight of the Silvers, all these people come together, and the sisters themselves aren't particularly close. They're not estranged, but they just don't understand each other very much, and the strangers don't know each other at all. And this is kind of, they end up going on a cross country quest to find the one man who they think can help them. So it's like a combination of Fringe and X-Men and all this other stuff. It's really and they're being chased by pretty much everyone. They have this world's version of the FBI on their case. They have a former member of their group in another timeline who, they don't remember him. He remembers them, and he hates them for his own crazy reasons. I mean, they have all these kinds of threats. So the book one is how they come together across the country, become a bit of a family. Book two, Song of the Orphans, expands their struggle, and it's more about, they know that this world they're on is on the same apocalyptic course that their old world was on. So they have to find a way to stop it. And this is their new, this is like their adopted world. They still don't know it very well, but, this is the only world they have. And so they're determined to do everything they can to stop it. It's really, and this is where, this is where sci-fi and fantasy kind of come together with the whole, apocalyptic quest kind of thing.
And that, I mean, I think that quest is so incredibly appealing. It really is in many ways part of why it's such a page turner, is like, what's going to happen next? Where are we going next? Like, this constant movement, I think, is really,
Well, thank you.
really exciting, right? And it's also, it is like you mentioned, the woman who was dealing with her sort of family medical
Mm-hmm.
troubles, the escapist. Um, the escapist like option that it gives you
Mm-hmm.
is so important, especially like in the political climate we're in right now. Basically, I mean, I I don't want to speak too. We're actually recording this kind of right after the Florida earthquake or the Florida hurricane.
Right.
I'm not sure exactly when it's going to air. I have it in my calendar somewhere, but sort of like right now as we are speaking, it feels a bit like we are living in
I know.
Revelations. You know what I
Seriously.
mean? And so with all of these things that are happening, escapism is becoming just so much more important in our everyday lives.
Yep, definitely. And yeah, it's. I wanted a story that was, when I say light, that it is fantastical enough to pull you out of your mind and the real world struggles and everything else, and kind of give you a nice fantasy tale. But I also wanted to have themes in there, even if they're not apparent to everyone. That it's not just pow pow pew pew. This is
Mm-hmm.
all the characters in my book. The main characters go through like their own personal emotional journey, and there's just a grander theme about time. This is something I got from my cancer struggle too. The whole notion of this very, very strange relationship we all have with time.
Yeah.
Um, and the characters in my book are these are all young people, relatively, who never faced immortality before, and then suddenly the world ends all around them. They're saved for reasons they don't even know, and now they're being hunted on a world they barely understand, and they are, and even for the ones who have the power to bend the clock, they realize that time is not their friend, and they're constantly struggling against it. And it becomes a matter of, are we just living to survive, or is our lives in this world going to be something more?
Ugh, and it's such a theme that, every day we encountered. Like when's the last time or how long did you go without saying like, gosh, I wish there was more time in the day, like to get
Oh yeah,
everything done? Or when's the last time that you were like, oh, this is taking so long, I wish I could just fast forward the clock? It's this real this trap that we find ourselves in, yet at the
absolutely,
same time it feels so relative to what is happening psychologically. You know what I
right.
mean?
Yeah, it is definitely. It's. I wish I had half the devices I wrote about in my book.
Oh yeah, that's all aspirational right
Oh,
there.
I get so jealous because I can that way I can like write 8 hours, but only lose 2 hours of my day, so I can do other things like freelance and have to spend time with my fiance and everything. It's like it's just there are not enough hours in a day to do
Mm,
everything you want to do, and at some point you get so you're running on a hamster wheel so fast that you forget about like just the little things that make life worth living,
mm-hmm.
and
Yeah,
it
you
just
forget
your
to
day.
appreciate time.
Right, and your day just becomes like a daily to-do list,
Yep.
and that really makes it tricky. So, and I've been thinking about that a lot too, just over these past 2 days. As I told you before the interview, my stepmother died yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and she was 75, and she'd been married to my dad for about 28 years, and she'd been sick for a long time, but it was just still kind of blindsided us all, and so
Yeah.
it's just something you think about mortality a lot. And luckily she and my dad, they traveled all over the world together. They've been retired for at least 15, 20 years, so they really got to like live and do things together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really the aspirational models, because there are some people who just work until the day they die, and it's if they love it, that's great, but there is more to it than that. And so my fiance has been very good about that, because before her I was that guy on the hamster wheel, just going, gotta do this, gotta do this, gotta do this. And she's very good at pulling me out of my continuum and just getting me to kind of like stop and just focus, and just on little things, just little pleasures.
Absolutely. And it is so, I think, telling and so enlightening how people who do have limited time or
Yep.
people who have their time threatened have a perspective that is we can all learn so much from.
Oh my
You know,
God. When I was getting chemotherapy,
mm-hmm,
this was at a cancer hospital in Tampa, Florida, and I was probably the most fortunate person there, because I had at that point a 95% chance of beating my tumor,
mm-hmm,
and because after the surgery and the chemo, but there were other people who only had like a 20% chance of surviving the rest of the year. and they were some of the most serene people I have ever met.
Yeah.
They were just like, I wasn't at that stage because I still had a question mark. I was like, I pretty much is almost a given that I would survive it. But for them, it just it changed the whole nature of time with them, and it changed their focus. And suddenly, all the little things in the world, and I had that for a little while. At the worst of it, where all the the little problems of the world and my own life and things like that just didn't matter.
Yeah.
And it's like some of the freest I've ever felt in my life
Yeah.
at that moment, where it's like, but it only lasts so long after you survive it. Then it comes back and it's just kind of like, oh God, I got to do the dishes, and no, I got to do this, and it's just human nature. I don't think there's ever you can never fully get rid of it, but at sometimes you can just kind of check yourself and say, okay, I am a little bit stressed right now. I need to back off and just appreciate what I have.
It's true, part of what time does for us is it makes things temporal. And so even
Yep.
this is kind of meta, but even something like really having a deep appreciation for your time and having that quick, sharp focus of like what matters and what absolutely does not
Yep.
matter can only last for so long until it
Yeah.
all starts to shift again.
Yep, and all the characters in my book at one point or another, they look back at their old lives on the old world. They're kind of like they could not believe the things that got them stressed back then.
Yeah.
After
Isn't
seeing the
that
world
funny?
end, and after seeing, after their umpteenth attempt of, people trying to kill them, and it's just like, it's like, oh my God, I used to worry about being overweight. It's
Yeah.
like what, like 5 or 10 pounds, and it's like, how did I ever worry about that? So yeah, and by book two, there you can almost practically feel their different mindset. They are focused on what matters, almost to a fault. They have to be reminded that it's okay to fret a little bit. It's okay to think a little bit for yourself, um, especially if there's somebody new you meet that you're interested in. It's kind of like don't like give up on that person just because you feel like you're too busy or it's not important enough. Take care of yourself a little bit.
Oh my gosh, what a good lesson to learn that so many of us learn too late. And I
Yeah.
think it really mimics this same thing that happens when people get outside of their comfort zone, like when
Yeah.
people travel and experience new cultures and experience things that are so profoundly different than how they were
Yep.
raised. Obviously their horizons broaden and they start to look at their own lives with a more critical eye and say like, why am I obsessing over
Right.
that thing? That's not a thing.
Yeah. But sometimes, you can be a little bit too much big picture. Like some of the biggest
Yeah.
enemies in my book, these are the Peltiers. These are a family of three people from the far, far distant future. They have temporal powers up the wazoo. I mean, they're practically gods.
Mhm.
And they see essentially all the different parallel timelines at once. So,
Okay.
if they are just leaving their house one day, they see the branching strings of the future where they go this direction in one string, this direction in another. It's all simultaneous to them.
Mhm.
So they have a completely different way of seeing the world, but they are so focused on the multiverse and basically the billions of different versions of their lives, different billion different versions of Earths out there, that they realize that even just the death of one or two of them, it's not such a big deal. To the people who are living on
Ah,
the world, it's a big deal, but for them, it's just kind of like, oh, we can kill one or two. Sure, why not? There's still billions. And
that's
so
tough.
it's like a cosmic immorality in a way. They don't see it as immoral. They have their own goals, but it's something that happens when your perspective changes. It's not always for the better, seeing the big picture, especially when you're stuck in the big picture.
Ugh, and it's like there's so many parallels just between that and the way that we have been shepherds of our own planet for so long and
Yeah,
the mistakes that we've made because our perspective is like a very humanistic one and it's a bit wider and we don't think about the creatures that we're displacing and we don't think about how they
right.
connect to everything else in nature and it's I love these kinds of themes that just relate to so many other deep experiences that we all have.
Right, yeah, and it drives me crazy, especially now, like to get political,
Hmm.
to see about these still after all the evidence and all the consensus, the anti-climate change people
I
who
know.
are just working off complete canards to the point where it's gotten to, well, if liberals are for it, I'm against it. It's like,
Hmm.
oh, it's not enough. It's like just take a step back and look at this from a more scientific point of view and don't just like go with your prejudices. And increasingly, it just yeah, I have to like pull away from the news constantly because I'm gonna
It's
like
tough, yeah.
grind my teeth into nubs if I don't.
And even if you want to ignore science completely because totally ignorant to it, just like from an ethical point of view, just a
I know,
human point of view,
I know.
it's just yeah, it's so hard, and I think that's another real strength that literature brings to society is that themes can be really investigated and they can be kind of fleshed out in
Right.
a much more metaphorical way
Yep.
and driven home much more, like what I do is very meta in a sense. It's very like, or maybe it's not even meta. That's the wrong word. It's kind of the opposite. It's very concrete. It's like, here's the evidence and let's talk about exactly what we're talking about. But what I think that authors and especially fiction authors bring to the table is this deeper conversation about things using metaphors and characters and scenarios that
Right.
force you to think about it, even if you're a little bit afraid to dive into it otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah. And from a writing point of view, you have to be really tread carefully when you do
Mm-hmm.
that because the minute you get too heavy-handed, the minute you show your cards, a lot of times, I know what happens with me. A wall of defensiveness goes up. It's like, yep, someone's trying to moralize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's those people who kind of sneak the point in that are really the ones who end up changing the most minds.
Oh yeah.
It's just the way we work, and it's still a balance I'm trying to find. Like I don't want to hammer people down with like this is the point of my story, and you're about to listen.
Yeah. The moral is
Yeah, exactly. So I don't want to do that, but at the same time, I don't want my stories just to be about nothing. So it's definitely it's a hard balance, but the
yeah.
writers who do it well are oh, they're so good.
And there's so much to say about not even proselytizing, but just putting people in a position to think.
Yeah,
Like you don't even have to tell them what to think, just make them have to think so that they have to come up with their own conclusion. Because so often we live in a culture and a society where it's very easy to just avoid difficult
yep,
emotions. We can just hide from them. Anytime something is conflicting, anytime that we
yep.
have, ambivalence about something, instead of just being in the ambivalence and understanding what that really means, we're like, no, 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 I'm going to come up with the right answer and then I'm going to ignore it and I'm not going to feel it and I'm going to not think about it and let's play video games.
Yeah, it is a pure defense mechanism, and in
Mm-hmm.
some way, for some people, it's like a survival mechanism.
Absolutely.
They would be miserable if they were constantly like just embracing the reality of every situation. I know I would go nuts. This is why I have to turn off the news after a short. I surf the web while eating breakfast, and after a while, it's like I read half an article, and go, ugh, and I have to close it because otherwise I'm going to lose my mind. I don't want to be ignorant to this kind of stuff, but I just there's only so much I can take in one sitting,
Yeah.
and you got to portion it out because otherwise you're going to go crazy. You have to still take care of yourself.
So I have to ask because we've been talking about time and the meaning of time and sort of the outcomes of manipulating time. And basically because time in many respects is, I don't know, fundamentally infinite. I mean, you could argue about that and whether or not it actually has an arrow, depending on
Right.
the physics paradigm that you're working within. Kind of to our perception, time does have an arrow, but when you get into the quantum mechanics, things get super weird.
Hmm.
But like describing all of these and being able to take cross sections of time at all these different levels and at all these different philosophical levels, to me, it's just an endless supply of fodder. It's fascinating. I've read so many books about time, and
Me
that's what
too.
really attracted me. Yeah, right to this. And I was wondering how much I don't know, like the Chang novella Arrival, which was made into this wonderful, beautiful sci-fi film. Had you read that before? Did it
I
speak to you at all?
I had not. I've only seen the movie,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which I really liked, and I thought I'm afraid to spoil it for people, even though it's been out for months. But I thought the temporal twist on that was very clever.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, So that definitely, I thought that was well done. But I really need to read that short story. I've
Yeah,
heard
I
so
mean
many good things about it. I think it's
it's
called The
short and
Story of
it's
Your Life.
story of your life, and it's a bit older. I mean, it's still not old. Like I think it's
Right.
from 2002 or something like that, and won many awards. But it's just another example of like, and this one's a little more straightforward. It's it's
Hmm.
a beautiful twist, but it's like one kind of focal
Right.
conversation about time, but it really does sort of bring a lot of these same issues to light. And I think for people who maybe haven't taken the time to think about time, because some people, I think these kinds of stories can, part of the reason that they're so compelling and so fascinating and so breathtaking, I mean, part of the reason that the entire Silver series is really intense to some extent is because these themes of time, of space, of earth, of the ground underneath our feet, of our foundations crumbling or being shifted can be
Right.
quite scary for some
Oh
people
yeah.
to dive into.
It is. It's terrifying. I mean, the world ends in chapter one of Flight of the Silvers, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't spare many details about it. The sky comes down in a sheet of solid light, almost like a big car crusher in a way. So the tallest buildings begin to crumble at the top, and people are screaming. It's horrific, because it happens so quickly with no warning.
Yeah.
Um, that it's amazing that my main characters weren't more traumatized than they are. It wouldn't be a very fun book if they were just all catatonic for the next 600 pages. So I had to, fudge a little bit, but obviously it's something that still affects them deeply. And it's hard not to feel tiny. And it's hard not to feel like you're just kind of like an ant on a leaf in a river near a waterfall. It's like, oh God, we're just, it's like I have no control over this. And it's like anything could end at any second. So I, it's a very, very hard thing to survive, to emotionally speaking.
Yeah, and you know what? I think what it speaks to is a theme that's missing from a lot of like thriller type stories, and maybe less so from the literature, but definitely more so from the adaptations, the film
Right.
adaptations of the kind of stories, is resiliency. Like
Mm,
we just treat characters like they're either weak or they're badasses. And if they're badasses, they never
right.
have time to feel about anything. They never have time to try
Oh
to
my God.
recover from anything. They're just like, I'm fighting all the things and I'm just really capable because I'm a robot. And that's just
Right.
not who we
There,
are.
there's nothing that bores me quicker than a flawless hero or
Yeah,
heroine,
right?
because I just cannot. As a supremely flawed person, I cannot believe in them. I don't.
Yeah.
But story wise, also, they have no room to grow when they start out into making all the perfect decisions and everything like that. They drive me nuts. These Mary Sue, Gary Stu type stories, and
Mm-hmm.
I, I don't know. I don't know why it's a thing, but I've made my characters so flawed that it annoyed a lot of readers, and they're just kind of like, oh, so tired of them, like just complaining and yelling, arguing with each other, and this and this and this, and but when you're stressed, that's what you do, especially with people you can like the two sisters. They have all these like lifelong buttons that they accidentally push with each other just because that's their
Yeah.
pattern. And in times of stress, they're always going to, of course, they're going to brush into each other and start squabbling over something because they are completely stressed. But it did drive a lot of readers crazy. I think some readers are looking for a complete escapism, not just escapism from the world, but of human fallibility
Mm,
in their
yeah.
stories. And luckily, there are plenty of books out there that'll cater to their needs. I just could never write that way. I would go nuts.
And that I think that's why, to some extent, some things within the fantasy and especially like the superhero genres,
Right.
don't really appeal to me unless
Yes.
the characters are truly flawed. And I don't just mean like he's a badass and then all of a
Right.
sudden sometimes he is funny.
Right.
Like that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really having moral struggles, ethical
Mm-hmm.
struggles, not, being traumatized by things that actually induce trauma instead of just being so resilient that they never even experience them, which mostly just makes me think they're not resilient. They're just robotic, they're not even
Right.
coping. And seeing real coping in a story, it it's something that speaks to me much more deeply.
And I think it speaks to a lot of people, and it has for a long time, which is why Spider-Man, from its very first year back in 1963, became Marvel's top comic.
Mm-hmm.
Because this was a guy who he doesn't even like he gets superpowers. He doesn't become a hero right. The first thing he does is what most people would do. Is like, how can I make money off this? Because we're poor. It's like you never saw that in a comic book before. You're like, whoa. And he was, without being whiny, without being like selfish or anything like that, he was just realistic.
Yeah.
And I think in a story with like web shooters and villains dressed like rhinoceri, it's important. It's crucial to have characters actually who behave in recognizable ways. And you're right; they don't have to be completely flawed. They don't have to like kick puppies in their spare
Yeah.
time just to be believable. But you give them real concerns, and they have to be afraid at some point that they're not going to get out of this
Yeah.
the situation that they're in. Because otherwise, what's the point? They're all just kind of like, I'll take care of this. It honestly baffles me that Superman is such an iconic character because he is the opposite of Spider-Man. He is the like not only is he rarely in doubt, but he's always so much stronger than the people coming after him. It's like
Yeah, I mean,
how did this work as a story? But it endured for decades, so I don't
it
know.
did, but it's really one dimensional, it's very plastic. And I think it's about maybe just the writers over the years of trying to build upon that and bring dimensionality to a
Maybe
template that maybe has less dimensionality. But when you start with depth of character, you have
right.
so much more room. It's much harder to do it the other way where you develop this super flat character or where the character is just a vehicle for some story point.
Well, you actually made a really good point now about Superman. He debuted in like right before World War II, when I
Mm-hmm.
think people needed an escape from everything.
Yep. And
And he
they needed like an archetypical American like
right,
exceptionalist, you know what I
but
mean?
Spider-Man came around after the uber conformity of the 1950s, the very dawn of the 1960s, when things were starting to
Hmm.
really come unglued in so many ways, and he was kind of like the flawed hero that people needed at that time. So I guess all these heroes are just a reflection of the era that they were kind of created in. I never really saw it that way before, but it makes perfect sense.
It's true. And then of course the ones that are oftentimes the most enduring are the ones that are I think really reflective but just vague enough that, it's like a horoscope. Like any
Right.
era, it still is going to speak to you.
Yeah, well, this is one of the reasons why Star Wars resonated so much with me as a kid and as an adult. Like the original trilogy, I am just the quintessential Star Wars nerd in that
Yeah.
sense because I related to Luke Skywalker. He didn't start the story as a hero. He was this kind of like farm brat, but by the time he became super powerful, he trained in Empire Strikes Back. He was by the beginning of Return of the Jedi, he was like, just like mopping the floor with all of Jabba's people. But you felt his progression. He didn't start the story that way, but he earned every bit of his heroism. He earned every bit of his power because you were with him for this journey.
Oh,
And
every young boy who grew up with Luke when they were
mm,
kids, I mean, he really is just their biggest icon.
yeah,
It's so rare to meet somebody who's kind of in that age bracket, like mid 40s to mid 50s age bracket, who
yep.
doesn't like obsess over Luke Skywalker.
Oh, I know. I tried to get my soon-to-be stepson, he's 18, to watch the original trilogy. He's like, yeah, I saw it. It was okay. I'm like, no, it wasn't okay.
I know.
I
It's
mean,
very
like,
hard to please nowadays with all the CGI that people expect, I
right,
think.
and it just a different mindset.
Hmm.
But I mean, yeah, like 5 liver spots broke out of my arm as soon as he said that. I'm like,
I
oh
know,
God,
right?
I'm so old.
Well, and
But
it's like
yeah,
this YouTube era of needing like scene, whereas Star Wars is slow to a lot of young people today. It feels like a
isn't that
slow
amazing to think that
movie.
way?
It
Yeah,
feels like 2001 feels to
right.
people that are like closer to our age, or it's like you see that cinema has just moved into this like faster and faster and faster and faster and
Yeah,
faster shift.
which is so
And even
funny.
2001 is lovely. Don't get me wrong. I love that
Right.
movie, but it is slow. Like you have
Oh
to
my
set
God.
across time. You can't watch it too late at night or you will fall
No,
asleep.
no, absolutely not. It's not even a movie for sober people, but it is.
Yeah.
It's funny because Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars movies, hated them. From everything I read, like one kid, he came up to him, was like, "Oh my God, I love you. I've seen Star Wars like 100 times." He pulled the kid aside. He's like, "Okay, promise me you'll never watch it again." It's
Oh my
like
gosh, that's so weird.
he just felt like it was a little bit too, too popcorny. So you can imagine what he
Yeah.
thinks of the movies now. What he would think of them now.
I know. Oh gosh, especially the prequels.
Oh
I
yeah,
know. We
that
don't
one.
speak of those.
I saw Phantom Menace like everyone, like all the Star Wars nuts. I saw it on the very first night, so I had not been forewarned at
Yeah.
all. And like, if you saw a time lapse photo of my face in the movie theater, my mouth was like I started looking concerned. I'm just kind of like, those. Why are those aliens a racial Japanese stereotype? That's
Oh
what's
my
happening here,
God.
and
It's
just
so bad. It's
it
so
broke my heart.
bad.
And as a creator, it like scares the bejeebus out of me because I never want to Phantom Menace myself. I don't want to
Or
do
be
like,
Phantom Menace by somebody else. Like get an
yeah,
option to make this into a movie and then lose all of the depth and all of the
oh,
development and go straight into the action, which is unfortunately what happens to a lot of science fiction and fantasy writers.
yeah. It's very very easy to lose your way no matter how good you are. Like Octavia Butler is one of the best. I mean, she is just amazing. Talk about message and meaning. I mean, you can't get through like the parable of the talents and her other book in that series without just like whoa, just getting a whole different view of humanity. And those books are more relevant than ever now. But she originally wanted that series to be a trilogy, and she got so writer blocked after the second one
Hmm.
that she just never finished it. It was
Yeah.
just like it. Sometimes, I mean, I had at least 2 months of writer's block before starting War of the Givens too, and I was like, it's like, where do you go from here? And I was just really, I didn't want to screw things up. I didn't want to Phantom Menace myself, and
Yeah.
I had also I was afraid I painted myself into so many plot corners. Like, how do I get out of this? It is, it's really really tricky. But luckily, with my fiance's help and some time, I found my way back in, and I'm having a blast again.
Oh, that's so good to hear. And I love that you owe some of that to time.
Yeah,
It really comes back to all of this because really, I feel like we just really shouldn't underestimate the power of sitting in silence and the power
yeah,
of like, instead of diving into everything all the time, allowing things to just develop, ruminating, allowing them to just be because we have these strikes of insight that just wouldn't happen if we were pushing pen to paper and like pushing
right.
against the clock all the time.
Yep. Um, One of the things I did between books, and I was originally hesitant to do. I love video games. I mean, it is probably one of my only vices. I mean, I could play the hell out of them. Like, if you give me Fallout 4, as I would just like say goodbye to Nancy, say see you in a month. It's like, or a game like Skyrim. It's like I love those big single player
Hmm.
adventures, and so I gave myself time to just I got a PS4. I sat down. I played all these exclusives that I've been missing out on over the last couple of years,
Yeah.
and oh my god, it was like just a band aid for the soul.
Yeah.
It got me out of my own head in ways that TV couldn't, or even a movie couldn't, because these worlds are immersive,
Yeah.
uh, and some of them are better written than half the books I've read. I played The Last of Us, which won like 8 billion Game of the Year awards in 2014, because it was written like a Cormac McCarthy book.
I
It
love
was
that.
so depth. If you're thinking like I grew up in the Pac-Man era,
Yeah,
it's like
right? Right.
to be playing this really detailed, like oddly beautiful apocalyptic game, because it takes place 20 years after a kind of an apocalypse. So you have these buildings like wildlife has grown over everything.
Yeah.
And it's like it was in some ways it was the most beautiful apocalypse I'd ever seen. The way they did it, and but between that and the story, it was just so. It just pulled me away, and it was just so beautifully done. It's one of the rare examples where something is like hyped to the heavens that was actually, for me, deserved all the hype and then some.
And isn't
And I
it
just
funny
love
or
stuff like that.
yeah, and isn't it I don't know, like interesting maybe is better a better word to use how in many ways these really in-depth video games have a lot of literary clout to them. Like,
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, I hear the parallels. You're talking about this like full alternate world that's so deep and so immersive. And of course,
Mm,
that's really a big goal of yours in your trilogy is to develop this alternate Earth that's
right.
it's very different. It's very different than what we know.
I
And in some ways uncomfortably so.
It was the most fun I've had with this book was building that world.
Mhm.
Because this is I didn't start from scratch. This is Earth where everything happened the same way until 1912, And then everything goes into what? Half of New York gets destroyed in a temporal explosion. Nobody knows what the hell's going on. It's 9/11 times a million, and it changed the world overnight. There's no World War One, just lots of little conflicts, and like it changed the whole nature. The United States became a completely sealed up country because they thought they were under attack,
Yeah.
and they of course blamed it on immigrants as dumb people tend to do. And it was 1912, so of course they're going to blame it on immigrants. But it was like it changed the whole nature of society. Even 100 years later, the United States, in my book, is still closed, and it's made their culture really insular. I mean, these people are more ignorant than ever in some ways, and even their culture, because they don't even let foreign films into the U.S. It's just the same vanilla stuff over and over again. The movies there are terrible because it's just the recycled pap. So it's really, with every change I introduced, I traced it all the way back to 1912 to say, okay, how would this be different? I didn't want to just do something different for the
Yeah.
sake of being different or the sake of being cool. I wanted to, even if I don't write about it, I wanted to understand myself. Why would this be different? Why would this change? Why would that change? And it was so much fun that I don't even want to write a story that takes place in the real world anymore. It's too much fun to do world building.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I mean, I can only imagine how, I don't know, kind of stimulating it must be. And of course, it's stimulating for the reader as well. I got to ask you, because I've taken so much of your time already, are you comfortable if I ask you the same two questions that I ask everybody at the end of my podcast? They're kind of big picture questions. I'm going to throw you some curveballs. You ready for it?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Sock it to
So,
me.
yes. So they're really sort of two sides of a similar coin. But when you think about the future in whatever context is really kind of on your mind right now, and that of course might be different right now than it would have been a week ago. But when you think about the future, number one, what is the thing that sort of most keeps you up at night? What's most disconcerting, worrisome? What are you really preoccupied by? And then on the flip side of that, what are you really hopeful and optimistic and actually do have a strong silver lining about?
The first part is, yeah, there's now more than ever. I don't hide my political leanings and my
Mm-hmm.
dissatisfaction with the state of current events. I think, and this isn't just a Trump thing, it's all the factors that led to him that just scare the living crap out of me, what is
Mm-hmm.
happening in this country. And I think more and more our entire uh, the way we handle information, the way we communicate with each other, there is something fundamentally broken
Yeah.
about it right now, where, especially on the internet, where it feels like nobody's communicating and everybody's just kind of yelling at straw man caricatures of each other.
Yeah.
And it makes it so worrisome and now you pretty much have like a alternate reality media on the right wing and a little bit on the left, but mostly on the right, where they've painted their own facts. They painted their own sky,
Yeah.
where even things that are blatant, they'll be like, "Oh no, this is good news," or "That never happened," fake news. And it's like, but this has happened everywhere. It's been documented, photos, this and this and this.
Yeah. Like
But
we're all looking at it happening. Like it's happening in front of our
right,
eyes.
I feel like there used to be a shared reality, even when people disagreed. They could at least
Mm-hmm.
agree on the general facts, if not the implications of it. But now you can't even agree on the basic facts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like when I look at these press conferences with first with Sean Spicer and then with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, there used to be people who were really good at spin, who would actually twist the truth around to the point where you came around to believe what they were thinking. But they don't do that. They just say, no, it isn't. It's
Yeah. They're
like,
not even, you're right. They're not even like skilled at
no,
it.
it's just like, nuh-uh. And that breaks my heart. And also, this is totally looking at it from a position of privilege. I thought we were a lot further along than we are when it came to race. Now, of course, anybody who's a minority would be like, hello, welcome to the party.
Yeah.
And, it makes me feel guilty that I thought we were further along. But the
Yeah.
things that
That you
I've
were kind of
seen,
like in your coastal sort of
yeah,
bubble. And
no,
yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it's like the worst I've seen was anti-Semitism, just a little bit of it growing up, and of course, the
Mm-hmm.
anti-nerd sentiment because I triggered that a lot. But when I was a kid, because I was a
Yeah.
huge nerd from the beginning, but it's nothing compared to what females, minorities, minority women have gone through, and it
Mm.
was just something that like the things that I've seen. people saying out in the open, like, "Oh my God, are you kidding me? Like, how does anyone still think that outside the 1950s?"
Yeah.
So I know, but the silver lining, the optimism is that I think this is still this is part of a healing process. I think this is like kind of the last gasp of the white hegemony in a way, that it's people who've been so frustrated after 8 years of Obama because this is just not the world they grew up in. The ones who,
Yeah.
I'm talking about the white privileged people now, and they're just Trump kind of in many ways, and not before him too, kind of gave him the freedom to vent and just to say
Yeah,
it
but
out loud.
he went from being kind of under the radar to being overtly kind
Oh,
of
yeah,
approving of this.
there was nothing. Most of the other Republicans dog whistle. He
Yeah,
uses a bullhorn. Uh,
exactly.
and he's terrible about it. But I think that things come in cycles, and I try to remind myself, and I remind other people that you read about scandals of the 1950s. There was a
Hmm.
show on NBC called Dance Hall USA, I believe,
Okay.
and it was in 1952 when. It's just like it was an American Bandstand type show. You just show
Yeah.
people dancing to the latest rock and roll music. There was a one episode, a white woman was dancing with a black man. The world nearly ended. It was like national scandal. The show almost got canceled. People had to apologize. It was like the biggest thing in the world. You look back on it now, 65 years later, you're like, what was the big deal about that?
Yeah.
And I hope that in 50 years, people look back and they won't even understand what the big furor was over gay marriage. Why were people even upset about it? Or why were people upset with
Well, yeah, I
Muslims?
mean, half the country already is like that,
It sometimes feels like that, but you know what? I
Yeah.
think even like the dumbest people, I can't imagine that they would get in the lather over interracial dancing in this day and age.
Yeah, right.
If they
That's
do,
true.
God help them. But I think, sometimes you just need to look back really far to see that we are moving in the right direction, and it may be slow, and we may be taking the occasional back step as we've done
Uh-huh.
recently, but in the grand analysis, we are moving in the right direction. My heart goes out to the people who are getting hurt right now by this just wave of vitriol
Yeah.
that's been going around, and it's small comfort to them. But I do believe if we can get past the global warming issue, if we can really come together and find solutions, that we can not just survive this, but we can move on. Now, there's a
I,
touch of gray in a silver lining. One last thing, and I touch on in
uh-huh.
my book. Um, when the bad guys in my book come from a far future utopia where there's like anybody can be whatever they want. They can be any age they want. They can be. There's no such thing as sickness anymore because you can just
Hmm.
reverse it temporarily and boom, you're better. Uh, and they live in such a utopia that like the things that they consider to be scandals, like a hangnail would be like a two-part medical crisis, on a drama. It's like your perspective changes,
That's true. It's
just
really
like
hard to know pleasure without knowing pain.
exactly like in 1950, nobody would complain about microaggressions because
Mm-hmm. It's
that is
true.
it is part of us evolving that we look
Yeah.
back on this and we say, oh, okay, this is not a big deal, or it's like so I this is what I hope anyway, is that that we'll advance enough that the big problems and we won't understand why they happened anymore, why gay marriage, why this, and
Yeah.
we'll have a healthy perspective, I hope.
Absolutely. Oh, I think that's such an insightful answer to those last two questions.
Oh,
And
thank you.
it really like, it speaks to me because I think that we are sort of, in the same camp when it comes to that. And I think a lot of the
Right,
listeners of this, sometimes podcasts can be a little bit self-selecting and it bums me out because
right.
of course I'm like, I want everyone to listen to Talk Nerdy, but
I
then I'm like,
know
some people probably would not enjoy this show. But I
it.
bet you there were just a lot of people nodding like furiously in their cars
Right.
while you were saying that.
It's a struggle for you, me, and everyone else who puts out a product because you don't want to alienate people, but you don't want
Yeah.
to. And this is the problem that news media has. They try to look so balanced that they end up putting their thumb on the scale.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
like, well, Donald Trump just like set an orphan on fire, but Hillary did slightly misstate something. So let's cover both these things with equal gravity so we look balanced. It's like, oh, it's like for God's sake, and it's one of the things that helped get him elected.
Yep.
That kind of false equivalence, and like people are still doing it, and it just makes me stabby. Like, it just drives me crazy.
I'm with you. I'm stabby. We can be stabby together.
Yes, we will be stabby together. Excellent.
Oh, man. Well, Dan, thank you so much. This was
Thank
such a
you.
fun chat.
Yeah, you too. This was fantastic. It's one of the best interviews I've ever had. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And guys, I want you to know that the Song of the Orphans, which is book 2 in the Silver Series, is available now. Of course, so is book 1 in the Silver Series. And I'm going to post some links to them in the show notes for the show. So I highly recommend it that you pick up these books and you check them out. And you can hold your breath just a little bit longer for the final book in the series. But you've got time if you haven't read them. You've got time. You can go ahead and dive into these, and before you know it, you'll have the final book of the trilogy in front of you.
Yes. Don't literally hold your breath.
Yeah, don't do that because you would die.
It's still a couple years away, the third book.
Exactly.
So.
And Daniel, before you go, will you let everybody know, like, are you more active on Twitter, on Facebook? Like, where can people find you and where can they harass you? Okay.
Twitter is the
Cool.
big one. I keep moving away from Facebook. It's more like an endurance test, but I love Twitter. I mostly lurk, but I'm trying to post more. You can find me at Silvers Guy, SILVRESGUY.
Awesome.
So, yes, please follow me, and I will be super political.
Good. At least they know what they're signing up for.
Exactly.
Well, Dan, again, thank you so much for joining me. It was a blast.
Thank you. This was great.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.